So thank you to everyone who has joined so far, and thank you so much to our panelists. I'm really excited, looking forward to a good discussion today. Welcome to the second webinar of the AI Challenge Cycle. Today we're going to hear from 3 experts who are working with AI across various sectors. Just as like a quick recap of what we've been up to in the challenge so far, just for participants, but also for our panelists. We had our first expert webinar with Chatham House's Alex Kristophina, who's sort of our resident in-house AI expert. And then we've had some contributions to our internal platform about sort of things that we're thinking about surrounding AI. But I'm hoping that this discussion is going to continue to spark a lot more of those ideas, particularly as we move into the policy solutions phase. So as I said, today we are joined by a panel of esteemed guests who I'm going to introduce shortly. And then after they give a few opening remarks, we're going to have a discussion with them, followed by a Q&A session where you guys will all get the chance to ask whatever questions have been on your mind. So this is a particularly timely discussion, just sort of this AI challenge in general, but especially this panel following the close of the AI Safety Summit in the UK yesterday. So looking forward to hear participants and reflections on that. We should not be keeping you any longer than an hour. And I'll just go through a few housekeeping rules before I hand it over to the panelists. So this event is going to be recorded and it will be put on the Chatham House YouTube page. So keeping that in mind, feel free to leave your cameras on, but if you're not comfortable with that, feel free to leave your cameras off. If you have your camera on and your connection is not so great, if you wouldn't mind switching it off, that would be great, just so that we can actually hear what your contribution is. And so I'm going to start recording the session now, and I'm going to start off with briefly introducing our panelists before turning it over to them to give some opening remarks. So I'll start with Yasmin Afina. She's a researcher that is dedicated to ensuring that current and future developments and deployments of AI-enabled technologies are equitable, that they promote peace, and that they disrupt the sort of Western and male-dominated discussions that currently surround AI. She's a researcher for the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, where she investigates the intersection between international security policy, law, and AI. She's also pursuing her PhD at the University of Essex, and she was a former fellow with the Chatham House's Digital Society Initiative, so working closely with Alex Kristophina. So welcome, Yasmin. Next, we have Charlie Beckett, who is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He currently leads the Polis journalism think tank, and he is also currently leading the AI project that's happening within that think tank space. He was also the director for LSE's Truth, Trust, and Technology Commission that reported on the misinformation crisis in 2018. And before joining LSE, he was an award-winning journalist at LWT, BBC, and ITN. And then last but not least, we have Kristophina Shilongo, who is a researcher and feminist who is interested in the topics of participatory governance and a sustainable approach to the development and deployment of technology in Africa. She is currently a senior tech policy fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, where her project that she's currently working on is investigating participatory governance frameworks in the conservation sector with the intent of actually applying them to the governance of AI and technology. So as we've seen this year, and as I've just mentioned, we have recently wrapped up with the AI Safety Summit in the UK. So AI is a very hot topic. So we're really lucky to be joined by these experts who are working directly in this field. I'm going to hand it over to Yasmin just to start us off with some brief remarks about her work as it relates to AI. So Yasmin, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and happy Friday from London. My name is Yasmin, and as Whitney kindly introduced me, I'm a researcher at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research and also a PhD researcher at the University of Essex. So the focus of my work is looking at AI in the military domain. And unlike what you see as a common narrative in the mainstream media and the press, it's not about killer robots, but rather it's the ways in which AI is being adopted and developed across the military domain. And you have a variety of applications. So obviously you have the weapon systems where you integrate AI into drones, for example, but you also have data analytics and intelligence collection to less sexy applications such as the logistics or inventory monitoring. It's everywhere, but yeah. And in terms of what I'm trying to do through my work, so first of all, through my PhD, I'm trying to look at how international humanitarian law, so the law that is applicable to armed conflict situations, can help to inform, shape, and eventually restrict the development of AI technologies for military targeting. So it's not about coding the law into the system, but rather looking at, based on what is out there and what the law says, how can we make sure that what we're trying to develop does not cross those boundaries and that the systems are compliant by design as much as possible. And then through my UN work, I'm trying to inform UN member states wishing to develop national security strategy on AI in the military domain through the development of a set of guidelines and best practices. And so I've just kickstarted this project, and I'm hoping to use a number of means, so not just research, but also consultations on one-to-one and a set of regional roundtables with stakeholders, whether it's governmental representatives, but also members from the academia, from civil society, and across regions, to make sure that in my work, their perspectives are reflected and that it's not biased, it doesn't have the Western-centric bias that so predominantly is present in the AI space. And in a way, it also resonates with the new agenda for peace that the UN Secretary General released earlier this year, where he was actually calling for member states to develop and publish a national security strategy document specifically on how they intend to develop and use AI for military purposes. So I'm going to stop there and keep it short and sweet, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions with everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yasmin. And I'm looking forward to diving a little more into some of the aspects of your work. Charlie, if I could get you to introduce a bit about yourself and your work next, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Whitney, and thanks for allowing me to be part of this. As you mentioned, I used to be a journalist for about 25 years, and that was a period, funnily enough, of technological change. I was one of the first people to use a digital editing machine at the BBC. And by the time I was leaving journalism, obviously the internet had come along, mobile phones had come along, and social media was just starting to kick in. And then I joined, as you said, I joined the LSE to set up this international journalism think tank, Polis, and the tech story continued. We worked with journalists all around the world, and they were all having to learn to do their journalism differently, because people were creating and consuming news in completely different ways. And then about 5 years ago, it sort of dawned on me that this thing called artificial intelligence was going to be perhaps the next kind of wave of technology change in journalism and, of course, in wider society. So we set up this journalism AI project, and we work with thousands of journalists and tech people around the world. And we build a whole series of product services for them. It's all free. We created this AI starter pack, an interactive starter pack where people could find out about journalism and AI. We created an AI discovery course that people can take through newsletters, through email. We created a whole series of academies for small newsrooms that we've run in different parts of the world. We're doing one in January in Spanish for Latin America, for example. And we've also worked with journalists from different news organizations working collaboratively on experiments with journalism and AI. So we've got this really rich network of journalists around the world, especially targeting, the so-called Global South, who are sharing their insights, but also sharing their thoughts about AI. And it's had a huge impact on the industry already. Even before generative AI came along with ChatGPT, it was doing quite boring things, actually. It was doing large scale, but relatively repetitive and relatively trivial tasks in themselves. It wasn't so complicated, but it was already having huge benefits right through the journalism chain of production, making content, and of course, the way that people consume it, personalized newsletters, for example, or automating research tools that allow you to do large-scale investigative data journalism. And then boom, this year with generative AI, the world has gone accelerated. All those trends have really accelerated, and there's been a lot of hype around it, both negative and positive hype. We saw some of that at Bletchley Park at the weekend. And we have been trying to work out what's really happening. So this year we did a big survey, a global survey of what newsrooms are doing with generative AI around the world. And obviously they're just starting. So most of them are kind of at the experimental stage, but they've already identified some incredible opportunities, but also some real risks. And some of those are the risks that Yasmin mentioned. You know, this is technology that doesn't have equity built into it. It can discriminate and it can make mistakes, and it can be misused either through enthusiasm or, of course, through malice. So it's an incredibly exciting time for journalism, which, as you know, has been going through decades, especially, you know, in countries where, you know, the political system isn't so healthy or the economy is not so healthy, and it's been struggling in many ways to survive. And so the hope is that this tech can kind of support and sustain journalism and news organizations at this critical period when, you know, reliable, authentic, verified information is absolutely important. Thanks.
That's great, Charlie. Thank you so much. And I think that work is super pertinent sort of as we turn the corner into 2024, because we've got so many global elections coming up that are really going to potentially sort of reshape global politics. So keen to dive more into that, as well as hear some of your thoughts on that AI summit that we've just wrapped up. So I'm going to turn now to Kristophina to give us some introductory comments.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you for the invitation and everyone for joining this call today. My name is Kristophina Shilongo, and I'm a Senior Tech Policy Fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. And my work has mostly been around technology and policy in Africa, mostly Southern Africa. And I just want to share maybe, I think there's a huge, a lot of expectations from AI on the African continent in terms of economic development, to address a multitude of socio-economic challenges. And there's also a focus on, you know, improving the quality of education, for instance, healthcare and sustainable agriculture. And what we've seen is last year I did 2 years ago, we did a study doing a landscape survey of the kind of uses of technology that are on the African continent. And we've seen applications in education. There's an example of South Africa. There's a Fundamate, which is an online study buddy that is trying to bridge the educational gap that is happening between in the country. We've also seen several initiatives from Google AI. So they're, you know, rolling out maternal health care applications in Kenya. We've seen they're using AI to screen for tuberculosis. So, you know, they're like really approaching very delicate medical issues. But of course, we've also seen the use of the rollout of AI, such as generative AI and more traditional ones. And this is changing the way that people are doing business. And it has also presented like new infrastructural needs and has transformed markets. For instance, we have become the product now. And so that means that it's very important that, you know, our data is not important, but I think it's in terms of like to be able to use these applications, everyone's data should be represented in data sets and data systems. And so the kind of challenges that we've seen, I think the most common one is what we've seen in terms of like new jobs and new skills. And that has come up with like new challenges. And the most prominent is the case of OpenAI in Kenya with the summer workers who were being exploited in terms of like unequal pay, but also in terms of like very oppressive, I would say, workspaces where they're not provided the adequate mental health and support. And we've also seen, you know, the introduction of, I mean, to take advantage of this AI, people also, you know, need new skills. So there's a huge digital divide. There's a lack of computer, like hard skills like computer science and so on. And there are also other, you know, localization issues, such as in terms of like languages. Africa has a dynamic range of languages. So how do people use these languages? And we've seen that technologies are more skewed towards English. I mean, they're also like Francophone African countries, and technologies are not, you know, addressing that, not let alone the local languages. There's also issues of moderation. Charlie was talking about journalism. So, what are the frameworks that we are rolling out in terms of like moderating online information and the information system and transparency? I think because AI is so elusive, I think transparency is very important, that people know that decisions are being made for them by machines or algorithms, and that their agency is given to them and some sort of like control. So people need to know how these decisions are made by AI systems. In terms of infrastructural needs, we've seen in terms of digital divide, the African continent has about 22% of people, the African population, that has access to the internet. And only 40% of those people, adults, are over the age of 18, and that is a very small amount. And so there's a huge digital gap or digital divide. And so people need infrastructure in terms of like devices themselves, but also internet as a whole. We've also seen the challenge of this balancing of basic needs versus like pushing for data infrastructure or AI infrastructure. So in South Africa, one has the largest amount of data centers, but South Africa also has a huge energy challenge. So people go for about 8 hours a day without electricity. So how do we balance like real immediate needs of basic needs such as energy and like this potential that AI has to offer on the continent? And so, my work is looking at that, all those challenges and the opportunities that are presented within AI, but also trying to do that through optimize that through AI governance. And it is very important that the way that we develop AI and deploy it within the African continent, and the way that data is managed, is done in a participatory manner and involves a wide variety of stakeholders, but also different approaches, because AI worldwide is a very nascent industry, and so we need to like test out new approaches. And that's why I'm looking at the conservation sector, which has historically used participatory governance frameworks to govern natural resources. I know it's very different from data. Natural resources are, they're limited, but data is not limited. And so we're looking at how people are involved, communities are involved in terms of like managing resources, and how you can roll out technologies into these communities, but also how governments can support them, and how this relates to like the global policy landscape. We've seen the DSA, the Digital Service Act, that was enacted last year in the European Union. And I think from experience of GDPR, we've seen that the Brussels effect is real, and the kind of like the approaches that were taken by the European Union has an effect all over the world. And so the approaches that are taken by the DSA have an impact on African countries and the Global South in general. And for us, I think the one thing that I think is very important for us is to see how not only digital services and large online platforms are held accountable in the European Union, but also how they can be held accountable in other regions outside of the European Union, where people don't have as much economic power or like political power, for instance. And I'll just stop there.
No, that's perfect. That's really interesting, and honestly a great sort of launch into our discussion, because a lot of the discussion on our internal platform, and sort of as a result of our first webinar, was about the unequal development and deployment of AI by a select few countries in the global north. And so your comments on sort of the expectations for AI like on the African continent, as opposed to like the reality of how many people actually have access to internet, let alone these tools like generative AI, are like definitely really interesting. And I think a lot of our participants will find those to be really useful to sort of developing their ideas about those themes as well. Kristophina, I'll put the first question to you. How do you think that we can ensure that technology like AI, that's developing incredibly fast, is sustainably developed and deployed in Africa and other parts of the global south, so that this gap between the global south and the global north doesn't continue to widen?
Yeah, that is, I mean, I think we think about this a lot. And I think the first approach is from a state or government approach of, coming up with appropriate rules to govern AI, and I think the most important part is respecting human agency. So one, how do you ensure that companies let populations know that decisions are made by artificial intelligence, or that certain services are distributed? Like a lot of government agencies, such as central banks in Southern Africa, are using AI technology to, bridge the financial inclusion gap. And so I think those, it's, providing, it has direct influence on, or impact on, the kind of like the accessibility of very crucial state services. And so how do we make sure that there's transparency around that and people know that decisions are made? One thing, I think right now on the African continent, only 4 countries have national AI policies, which is Mauritius, Egypt, Kenya, and Rwanda. And those have a strong economic focus. I don't blame them. There's a lot of economic challenges on the continent, but I think the most pressing issues that we've seen in terms of like inequity of like labor practices, the unequal distribution of benefits of AI, so like training certain AI on different populations, testing different products on African populations, has created either social and cultural like problems that are not just which we shouldn't just focus on the economic part of things. So bridging out to developing AI strategies and policies that expand beyond economic benefits, look at the social challenges and the cultural impacts. And the one thing I think that is important is like, how do we ensure that big tech companies are held accountable? Like if they cause harm on different societies and different people, how do we ensure that they are accountable to the kind of harm that they cause? And I just think also knowing and this in terms of like journalism, for instance, I just wrote an article on like how can journalism shape or influence AI policy on the African continent. I think the narrative that we've seen around the doom and gloom, the narrative about like, speaking about AI as if it has a brain of its own, is something that we should also like push against, and like really try to emphasize that, hey, these technologies are built by people and they determine the kind of the trajectory that it takes in our societies. And people don't lose jobs due to because of AI. They lose jobs because of their bosses and certain AI companies. And so those are the kind of, just knowing the stakeholders who are involved in like kind of like pushing back against certain narratives, advocating for governments to like focus on a wide range of other things beyond just like economic development. I think that is for now, like that's some of the things that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question. But that is really important to remember that as much as sort of, the gloom and doom has definitely been a huge narrative surrounding AI, particularly as we've seen the rapid development now of generative AI. It is important to remember that we can push back. And that's going to be sort of one of the things that we'll be thinking about as we move into developing solutions to address the rise of AI and what we can do to sort of turn it into a tool for good. You sort of touched on this, and I want to bring Yasmin into the conversation because I know that this is sort of one of your areas of expertise. But people are understandably sort of worried that the deployment of AI is going to turn into this neo-colonial tool, and that's only going to fuel current conflicts, or it's going to lead to new ones. So Yasmin, can you sort of expand on the risks that AI currently brings to conflict, and then maybe discuss sort of if there are any benefits that we can also see from sort of AI's application to conflict and warfare?
Thanks, Whitney. And maybe I'll start with like the benefits, and then I'll talk about the risk, because there's so much to unpack on the risk. I don't want to be like doomers or gloom and doom, but I think it's just
start on a high note.
But that's still we still cover the benefits, because like it's India, and we're developing this technology. It's got so much potential, and we want it to be done right? Like it's so in terms of the opportunities, so like in principle, the common narrative is that if you have AI deployed across the military domain, it can help in many ways, from, as mentioned before, the mundane, boring things like better logistics and better deployment and use of resources, for example, helping the training of members of armed forces through, for example, this is what they call the synthetic environment, where it's a sort of simulation, and you use that to train the way you use certain techniques, and also the way you use certain weapon systems, for example. Or even like in terms of, speaking of simulations, you can also think of the simulation of a certain attack that you are planning, and see if, for example, you will have disproportionate civilian casualties, in which case you should be sort of, for example, postponing your or changing the way you conduct your attack, for example. And then you also have the question of better situational awareness. When you think of AI, you also think about big data, and all of the data that everyone generates on a daily basis helps armed forces to get a better understanding of what is going on. So, for example, if you see that there's a high concentration of mobile phones connected to the network in a certain area, then you can sort of infer that there will be lots of civilians at that moment, precisely in time. So you should avoid, sending strikes at that time. And then there's also the question of opportunities with regards to speed, as things like missile technologies are, developing and in terms of progress. And you also need better capabilities to counter these capabilities that require speeds that sometimes the human brain just cannot compute, and you need these fancy computers to be able to do things before you can even think. But that is all in principle and in theory if the technology works as intended. So as Charlie mentioned, there's so many risks related to AI, and the examples that Charlie mentioned resonate a lot with the security and defense sector as well. So first of all, one of the risks that I'm thinking of is war is messy. It's inherently uncertain with so many variables, and you just don't know what is going on. And everything I said about, like modeling what is going on the ground, that is in theory, you can't be sure that it's actually an actual representation of reality. And the technology that you develop, it is being thoroughly developed and then tested before deployment, but then when you're testing it, it's tested in a sterile test environment where it's so different from what is going on in the ground. And then after that, there's the question of the technology not working as intended, or at least like the outputs that comes out of it doesn't match your expectations, in which case you have questions of accountability, which Kristophina sort of alluded to before, especially as the development of these technologies are concentrated in the private sector. I was just at an event not so long ago, and someone from the armed forces of a country basically mentioned that they had such a problem of skills and people willing to work for the government to help them develop the technologies, but they don't have these people because they don't pay as much as the tech companies. Like they can't match the salary of Google or Palantir or any other big companies, and so they have to depend on these contractors that where there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to their accountability. And then so just to give you an example in terms of things going wrong, a few years ago there was this leaked report on the National Security Agency of the US that is supposedly using AI based on data connected from people's phones, based on their location and their call logs, to identify Al-Qaeda couriers. And based on the patterns that are connected from the data, you could say that there is a high probability that this person is an Al-Qaeda courier and could be the target. But in the leak, was revealed was that one of the identified persons was actually an Al Jazeera journalist. So you can imagine all the things that come out of being mistargeted when you're relying on these technologies blindly without the appropriate processes to make sure that the decision is actually something that the armed forces are comfortable taking, but also are legal. And then I alluded to that before, and other than the technological risk, you also have the human factor, and it's not just a question of the lack of skills and knowledge. As we all talked about, there's a gap between these fancy technologies, and then the people actually using it? Do they have the right skills and knowledge to be able to operate it in a way that is meaningful, and they will know what the limitations are? And second, there's a question of the whole military culture is about certainty and everything being in order and everything, and the adoption of such solutions of AI that is inherently probabilistic and is not an oracle, and you rely on them, and you couple that with politically motivated choices by the military on what to use and how, in the end, it raises so many questions, because in the end, AI is a tool, and of course, like, not like any other tools, but how it is used and how it is deployed depends on people. And yeah, that's a thing that I think we should be talking more about.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think a big thing that I think a lot about and is really concerning is just sort of the ability of AI to promote disinformation, which Charlie was starting to touch on in his introductory comments. So Charlie, I'd love it if you could sort of speak a little bit more as to how disinformation, like as a result of AI, is impacting sort of journalism, but then also politics more broadly, because I know that's sort of like the intersection at which you work.
Yeah, sure. And I think, one big caveat is that Yasmin and Kristophina have both referred to this, that humans make decisions about using AI. So there is no technological fix to the problem of disinformation. Of course, AI can be used to fact check. It can be used. I was speaking to somebody this morning about trying to use, crypto technology, if you like, blockchain technology, to try and build in watermarks into imagery, for example, as a way of trying to clean up some of this disinformation. And certainly it's a huge concern. It already was before generative AI came along. We already had this ability to sort of flood the online spaces with misleading information. And, it's very, very frightening, especially when you look at some of these maps of the way that the disinformation travels so rapidly before the verification or the rebuttal can kick in. But I think there is a danger of us getting distracted by this. A lot of that disinformation is not by sort of shadowy foreign powers. It's often by our own politicians. It's often by activists who are very understandably partisan. And it's also by the public in general. We are very prone to sharing misleading information simply because we respond to it instinctively. So any strategy that tries to address this has to understand that human factor. It has to understand the reality of it. You can't just flick some algorithmic switch and make it all go away. As we've seen with social media, it's incredibly difficult to moderate in any meaningful way. And that's partly because, we enjoy the informational freedom and creativity and power that we have with the information and with the new forms of AI. It's quite remarkable, the creative potential that these tools have. So we've got to kind of balance, the possible harms that it can do, and also though the harms that you can do by trying to fix it. We looked at this back in 2018, as you mentioned, with our commission at the LSE, and I was really interested by how cautious many of my colleagues were. They're all people who want to reduce misleading information, but they're all very conscious that so much of it, what you think is disinformation, somebody else will say, no, that's my passionately held belief. And so there's a real danger that you don't want to sort of pretend that there's some sort of lovely consensus that we can get to, even if we had the tools. So I think we've got to be realistic and accept this is the nature of our society, that we are, in some ways, the problem is just an overabundance of information. I think that's almost as much as a problem as disinformation, that we are flooded with data and opinions and representations of everything that's happening all the time. So from a journalism point of view, actually one of the key tasks is going to be optimizing people's news diet, if you like. At the moment, people are getting ill, literally, by having too much news. It's not just because it's depressing. It's not just that you encounter loads of diverse views that you may not agree with. It's just this sense of never-ending torrent of commentary and reportage. So good journalism is not now about creating more stuff. So when we use the AI, we shouldn't be using it just to create yet more content. We should be using it to try and optimize people's experience. So it could be that you give people less. You try and personalize, the news service that you're providing for people so that they don't get swamped by information. It may be that you want to reformat the content. Sometimes you just want bullet points. Other times you might want long pieces with lots of context. And AI is one thing generative AI is really, really good at is reformatting. It can turn audio into speech. Translation is getting better and better. Kristophina quite rightly mentioned, the inequalities around this technology because it's so English-centered. But that's changing rapidly. We're working with people, as I say, in Spanish-speaking zones. We're working with people in the Middle East. Just last week, I was in Taiwan. I don't speak Chinese. Many Taiwanese don't speak English, but there we were using our mobile phones to communicate using a form of AI. So there's that potential there to help people access information in the way they want, and also to create in the way that they want. So yeah, human always in the loop. The big mistakes happen when you don't have an editing process. We saw with the Microsoft website, which had been automated, they fired most of the people who were working on their news website, and it went bonkers. It was publishing fake stories, it defamed people because they relied too heavily on the AI. So from a kind of journalism or a journalist trade union point of view, I think we should be less fearful of it taking all our jobs. I think there's a lot more that we need to do to be, I think Kristophina mentioned this, we need much greater skills. Journalists need much greater skills to use this technology. They also need much greater literacy. I'm appalled, frankly, at the shallowness and the hysteria of much of the coverage around AI. We just don't know it well enough. And because it's going to be part of every aspect of our lives, from, as you mentioned, from militaries, from security, right through, to retail and recreation, then journalists who are supposed to be able to report upon the world need to know how the tech works. And they also need to know, those issues that Yasmin and Kristophina were raising about what impact does it have? How can we empower people more? So in that way, I think, when we talk about disinformation, yes, it's a real big problem. But frankly, we've got a problem with our politics in many countries around the world, regardless of AI and fake news. But there's also, I think, in a way, a bigger problem of not being able to take advantage of this technology in a healthy way. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to follow up on one point, because I do, and sort of like Kristophina was saying, I do appreciate the fact that we can sort of move past the gloom and doom narrative and recognize that there are potential good things that can come from AI, even generative AI, regardless of sort of how it's portrayed in the media. So if there is some sort of potential for good, whether that's like increasing ability to access information, translation abilities, even though we do know that it does tend towards English at the moment, how could this sort of positively contribute to promoting democracy, do you think, especially as we enter 2024 and this big next year of elections?
I don't think it necessarily will. I think surely we've learned our lesson. I remember back in 2010, the Arab Spring, and Facebook was a sort of rallying cry for Democrats around the world, because we thought that social media technology was enabling these revolutions through the Middle East and this sudden democratization. But we've seen since then that authoritarian governments are just as capable of using this. Nasty, extreme, violent, right-wing, horrible groups, extremist groups, are also perfectly capable of using social media in a very destructive way. So I think it's really dangerous to talk about this technology having some sort of either beneficial or harmful effect. It will mold the way we have debates, of course. Fundamentally, the information space is much more democratic, but only in the sense of access. We all have access. We can all, start our own blog. We can start our own YouTube channel. We can do, within reason, anything we want. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be listened to. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to change things just because you've got media democracy. So I think it is really dangerous to sort of talk too much about the enabling or restrictive power of technology, because I think it then stops us doing the real political work. And I think that in some ways, our politicians are letting us down on this. That it's very tempting if you're a politician, especially if you're not doing so well in the polls. I'm kind of referring to the UK situation, I suppose. It's very tempting to go for the other forms of messaging that will send you viral, that will distract. So I think we're still hoping that our politicians can become more media literate and more media responsible. So AI is I'm afraid it's not neutral. Of course it's not, and it's definitely going to have impact on amplifying certain voices, changing the way that we have discourse online. I'm sure of that, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out. It's far too early to tell. Anybody who pretends, like Elon Musk pretending that suddenly we won't have any jobs left, is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard, ignoring all historical experience of technological change. There's the cliche that we always exaggerate the short-term impacts of technology. In practice, it's always harder to adapt these tools and systems, but that we also underestimate the longer term impacts as well. And that's because it's longer term and it's difficult to predict the longer term. My favorite example is the Industrial Revolution in Britain. No one thought that the Industrial Revolution would lead to free universal primary education, but it did. No one predicted that, but it enabled that. It made it necessary to have that. So I can't predict what the change will be, especially in political terms. I do know that I've just been to various conferences with security people, diplomatic people around the world, and as you said, there's a lot of elections coming up. As I mentioned, I was in Taiwan and they've got one coming up, and yes, their political space is being bombarded with messaging of a not very helpful nature obviously from China. So of course it has a real material influence, but in the end it's about real people making real political decisions, I think.
Thank you. That's great. That's really, really interesting. And I think that is sort of a perfect segue to sort of jump into questions and answers. So participants in the audience, if you guys want to raise your hands or just pop questions in the chat, I will take questions that way. So either way is fine, and you can pitch them to a specific panelist or ask a general question. Whatever is on your mind, let us know. So go ahead and raise your hands or pop questions in the chat. All right, first question from Echo.
Thank you. So my first question goes to Charlie, and that has to do with misinformation. And I wanted to ask, since we are kind of like, as you've rightly stated, that we are in an age of AI, my question to you will be that how do we know if the news we watch is even real at all? Or how do we know what we actually see on social media as news is even real when we've witnessed cases or there have been instances where AI was used to actually generate and create fake news, for the general public to consume? And what happens when, say, you now speaking in the African context, where we have ethnic and tribal issues to be very sensitive and particularly, very concerning within our national settings? What happens when AI is used, say, to generate misinformation about a certain ethnic group or about a certain tribe? And how can that potentially, stir up conflict? And also to the political setting, how can AI be possibly used by an opposition party or a ruling government, to generate misinformation, not just, through fake news or like content or anything of the sort, but also with images, as well as we've witnessed with Midjourney? Because I'm not only familiar with ChatGPT, but there are other artificial generative AI models. So how do we know, again, back to my main question, how do we know what kind of news we are consuming, whether it's legitimate or it's not real, or so it's kind of like a very confusing and the uncertain times that we live in. So just I'd love an answer to that.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. We are moving into a phase when we will not know automatically. We're already there, to be honest, where we don't know automatically when we're communicating digitally, be it through messaging or Zoom call like this, or going online or going on social media. You don't know automatically in the way that you sort of do when you're in real life. And so that's interesting and, possibly a great concern. The answer to your question is partly, again, I always say, go back in history. We can see that there have been, bad politics, bad political discourse for decades and centuries, if you like. Human beings are imperfect. We can also see that previous technologies have had, malicious impacts. I think of, for example, the role of radio during the Rwanda genocides, so that it's not just about online, it's not just about, certainly not just about AI. There are potential technological solutions. I mentioned in passing, talking this morning to somebody who's going to try and use blockchain as a way of having a kind of verification process. And you will be able to, when you see an image, you'll be able to press a button or go on your app and it will say, yep, we can verify that image. It was definitely taken by the BBC in Ghana on this date. And it's been slightly modified. They, reduced the pixelation or something, but it's the true image. So there is sort of technological tools, but basically it's down to common sense. And it sounds trivial, but I think whenever you come across something on online that excites you, you should immediately be thinking, hang on, why am I responding to? Am I responding to this emotionally, or am I responding rationally? And 90% of the times we do respond emotionally, and that can be really healthy. So, for example, if you see an image of somebody suffering, you may feel great pity and want to help them. So there's nothing innately wrong with emotions, but it does blur our ability to judge. And in some ways, this is a very practical thing. It's a question of you seeking sources. I would say, for example, the BBC, a public service, accountable, journalistic institution that is held to account by law and by other due process. And from the track record, your experience of consuming journalism from the BBC is that sometimes they'll get it wrong, but they'll always try and correct it. Yes, they have some biases, but they at least strive to be relatively impartial. So I think you just make some common sense choices, that if you are just going to scroll through your whatever it is, your Twitter feed or whatever, and you're going to react to what people are posting there, then you are building in a bias against understanding. We are all going to have to be more thoughtful about the way that we consume information. And in the journalism space, the journalists are going to have to work hard, as I suggested earlier, sometimes using these tools to be more transparent. And by transparent, I mean in quite a practical way, saying, hey, we are in Gaza. We saw something and we filmed it. And it was very difficult, but we think this is what's happening here. And we tried to get some other sources to try and give us different perspectives on what we think is happening in this situation. And therefore, you will have a relationship where perhaps you will have more confidence with that particular source. So I think, it's quite frightening. You're constantly being told, oh my God, that's fake, that's fake, that's fake. But what's interesting about, for example, the current conflict in Gaza and Israel is that most of the fake imagery, for example, that we've seen has not been AI generated. Hardly any of it. Virtually none of it is AI generated. You don't need to. What people are doing, they're taking images from different conflicts, or they're misattributing them. They're saying, oh, this is happening, in Gaza, when it's not. It happened 10 years ago in Syria. So it's human beings deliberately trying to mislead people, but they're not doing anything clever with tech. So I think we have to respond as human beings, in a kind of thoughtful, skeptical way. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for that question. I'm going to move next to Will.
Thanks. Firstly, thanks so much for such an interesting conversation so far and organising. Kristophina, I found what you said really interesting about developing rules for AI, and also Charlie a bit about pushing it back against the narratives of sentience and anthropomorphizing language that's often perpetuated by industry. And I find it really interesting the conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest of governments inviting, say, big tech executives to develop these guidelines, which we're told are so important, obviously. So 2 questions. How do you see things like the possibility of regulatory capture playing out, perhaps akin to maybe like Google in the early 2000s? And then do you think it's necessary? And if so, how do we combat these narratives perpetuated by these people who inherently do have vested interests to use AI in certain ways?
Thank you all. Those are very important questions. And hard to answer as well. But in terms of, you're right about the regulatory capture. I think what we've seen right now with the DSA, for instance, and I think it's the transparency reports that companies themselves had to, develop, is that, they are also obscuring things and, leaving out certain risks, for instance. So they choose the kind of risk that they want to be looked at. And so I think that's where participation and enabling people to kind of feed into this. And two groups of people or stakeholders come to mind. First, the civil society organizations who are collecting or doing research about harm and harm caused to different communities. So discrimination, how Mozilla has been working on the YouTube Regret program or privacy not included program. So providing evidence on the kind of harms and risks that are caused to certain populations. I think that's very important to be able to inform regulations and policies around that. And the other thing is just, Charlie mentioned this as well, just education of journalists to be able to speak about the narratives around, a true reflection of the narratives around AI. And I think also, and one thing that the DSA kind of addresses is this thing of data sharing. So, allowing certain organizations and certain individuals to be able to access data so that they can do research and see the kind of impact. And I think that is something that I would very much like to see adopted in Africa, for instance, in different national AI policies and regulations, that they should be able to allow them to access research data. So that's all I can say. But that's a very good question, and it's a reality. And I think in terms of just the global south, the political power as well, I don't think a lot of governments have a lot of power in terms of over AI companies or tech companies in general. So I think that's where the global collaboration and support comes from. The EU is a great or strong, one of the biggest regulators in the world, and I think they should be as well be able to think about AI and technology ecosystems as just not just impacting the European Union, but also that it's a whole ecosystem that involves the global south. And so trying to expand the rules to also apply to researchers outside of the European Union. How do we ensure that collaborations can happen between organizations within the EU and organizations in Africa or Asia? So expanding rules.
Great, thank you so much. Sophie, I saw you had your hand up. I'm not sure if you still want to ask a question. No pressure if not, but I wanted to give you the chance.
Sure, yeah, no, I'll ask. I think I'm on.
You're echoing a bit weird. I'm not sure if you're on here twice.
I'm on there twice, so I don't know.
There we go, that's better.
I was just wondering thank you so much, by the way. I was just wondering what you think about the outcomes of the AI Safety Summit in the UK, and whether you think that they'll make a real difference, given that certain signatories, such as China, were were less, I suppose, pro some of the outcomes. I'm talking specifically about one that was allowing governments to test their latest models for national security risks before rolling them out to companies and businesses. And Yasmin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And then just a kind of general one, I think there was one where essentially a panel of experts will write an annual report about kind of the current risks that they see from AI for that year, an international panel of experts. So I just wanted to kind of test what you three as kind of experts in your field see in terms of the benefits of those two initiatives.
Maybe I'll just like give some quick initial thoughts, because literally like the safety summit just finished yesterday, so it's still a bit fresh in my mind. I think in terms of the the summit in itself, you may have seen the Bletchley Declaration that came out of it. A number of countries have signed it, and in a way, I think it is quite remarkable in the sense that there has been so much work that was sort of officiated during the safety summit, but then you also have to sort of remember that they didn't start from scratch when they first met on the 1st of November. There's a lot of work that the civil servants did in the background, and at the end, like at the safety summit, it was the heads of, it was the sort of high level representatives of countries that came and basically just made everything official and negotiated and on the little things that remained contentious. But I think it's still remarkable that they managed to sort of agree on a certain number of things. And I think that one of the main things that I'm most excited about is the AI Safety Institute that they're establishing, and the fact that like it will be a sort of almost government-led initiative to audit the safety of frontier models that private companies are going to be developing. And I think that it's an interesting way to sort of govern AI technologies, because it sort of acknowledges the reality that as much as we can complain and about it, and we can see the risks of it and the issues with it, fact is that the private sector holds a lot of power and resources to develop these technologies, and it's also concentrated that you have to find a solution. And I think that I'm excited to see what comes out of it. But the only thing that I would add is that there's so much going on as well. I mean, you saw, like, for example, the US and the White House's executive order on AI that came out just earlier this week, that people were almost afraid that it will steal the thunder of the UK AI Safety Summit. And I'm just curious in terms of seeing how everything will turn out, because it's important to have ongoing discussions and academic sort of research that looked at, for example, the risks and how they evolve and everything. But then there comes a question of implementing those recommendations that come out of this political declarations, executive orders, and whatnot, and also how they interact with each other, because in the end, I don't really want that to sort of become a race of people cutting ribbons and coming up with a lot of regulations. Yes, sure, but then first of all, do you have the right implementation measures that are in place to make sure that it's it will actually do the things that it says it will be doing? And second, how will they work with each other, and do they work in a complementary manner or in a sort of competitive manner? You don't want something where a piece of regulation is more influencing others in a way that is in the end harmful to certain communities and people. So I think that it's still early to say anything about it, but I think there's a lot to see. There's a lot to observe.
Thank you, Yasmin. I just want to let Kristophina or Charlie sort of add anything else to that before we start to close out. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for a fantastic discussion. That was fantastic contributions from our panelists. Very, very interesting and great questions from all of our participants. So thank you guys very much for your engagement. We're going to say goodbye and thank you to our wonderful speakers now. But if I could get all the CFC members online to just hang on for a few more minutes that we can go through next steps of the challenge and a couple of other events that we want to flag for you guys. But if you guys could just join me in giving our speakers a round of applause for their contributions, we really appreciate you guys' time and engagement with CFC. So thank you.
Thank you for organizing this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.